Dennis Nilsen was a monster he created for himself by not being able to handle regular human connection and by letting his dark sexual fantasies develop. On November 23, 1945, Dennis Andrew Nilsen entered the world as the second child of Elizabeth Duthie White and Olav Magnus Moksheim. In 1940, Olav, a Norwegian soldier, had made his way to Scotland, where he met and promptly married Elizabeth. However, his duty with the Free Norwegian Forces left him with little time for his growing family. Olav didn't try to spend time with his family either, which was Elizabeth's major source of contention while they were still living with her parents after their wedding and the births of their 3 children. Elizabeth and Olav tied the knot in May of 1942, but just 6 years and 3 children later, Elizabeth had had enough. Her parents were on board with the choice because they had never approved of the pairing. Nilsen was a shy but daring child who recalled picnics in the Scottish countryside and long walks with his grandfather as some of his earliest childhood memories. To Nilsen, the man was a great hero and protector, and life would be empty until he returned after his fishing voyage. Nilsen's grandfather had a rapid fall in health in 1951, although he continued working until he died of a heart attack on October 31, 1951, while at sea. At age 62, he passed away. Before his burial, his remains was brought back to his hometown for a public viewing in the White family's house. After Nilsen saw his grandfather's lifeless body, his mother Elizabeth reportedly asked if he'd like to visit him, but didn't tell him that his grandfather had died. Elizabeth reportedly told Nilsen that his grandfather was only sleeping and had gone to a better place. In the years that followed, Nilsen became increasingly reclusive and reticent. He was said to have spent a lot of time alone, both at the harbor watching the herring boats and at home, where he rarely took part in any of the family's activities. Nilsen began to resent his mother, grandmother, and then stepfather's adoration of his older brother, who was more popular than he was. Nilsen began to spend nearly as much time with his younger sister as he did with his grandfather, and the two became quite close. Nilsen claims that he went to the beach by himself in 1954 or 1955, fell into the water, and was nearly swept out to sea. He said he was convinced his grandfather was on his way to save him, and then a sense of calm descended upon him. Another small child carried him to safety on the coast and saved his life. Elizabeth reportedly left her parents' home and into a flat in Stricken shortly after this alleged incident. She eventually wed a builder called Andrew Scott and had 4 more kids with him. Nilsen, like many others at the time and to this day, hid his sexuality from family and few friends after he came to terms with the fact that he is gay during the outset of puberty. His attraction to boys, he reasoned, was just an extension of his love for his little sister Sylvia. Nilsen once sexually attacked Sylvia by groping her to see if his idea held water. Nilsen also cites an incident where an older boy molested him and he didn't react negatively as evidence. Olav Jr., Nilsen's older brother, became convinced that Nilsen was gay after being the victim of a sexual attack while he slept, and Olav Jr. began publicly ridiculing and ostracizing Nilsen because of this. Nilsen joined the Army Cadet Force when he was 14 years old. He wanted to join the British Army so that he could leave his little town. He worked at a canning factory for 3 weeks before he enrolled, and it seems that experience cemented his decision to leave his hometown and become an army chef. Training for his 9-year commitment to the army began at St. Omer Barracks in Aldershot, Hampshire, in September 1961, after he had completed the necessary entry tests. Later in life, he would say that 3 years of training were the happiest of my life. He enjoyed the chance to see the world and thought it was cool that the Queen and Field Marshal Lord Montgomery of Alamein attended a parade his regiment was in. Nilsen's feelings surfaced while he was stationed in Aldershot, but he was able to keep his sexuality a secret from his co-workers. He did this in a number of ways, one of which was by taking solo showers and never using the shower facility when other soldiers were around. By the middle of 1964, Nilsen had aced the catering exam and been posted to the 1st Battalion of the Royal Fusiliers in Osnabrück, West Germany. Nilsen's drinking increased while he was overseas, and he and his comrades became known as a hard-working, bawsy lot. Nilsen and a young German man once stayed at the former's apartment after getting drunk there. On the floor, Nilsen came to. Nilsen stated this fed into his twisted sexual imagination while he insisted nothing transpired between them. A youthful, lean male character was frequently included in these fantasies in a passive, unconscious, or even dead state. After that, Nilsen actively pursued sexual contact with his co-workers. He would get drunk with them in the hopes that they would attack him when he was unconscious. Nilsen served as a cook in Norway for the British Army after moving there after his 2 years in Osnabrück and passing another culinary certification. Aden is currently a part of Yemen, but in 1997 Nilsen was stationed there and worked as a cook in the Al Mansura prison there. He had safer assignments in West Germany and Norway, but this one was far riskier. Nilsen reflected on the loss of several men in his unit. Many of them were killed in ambushes on the way to the army barracks. According to Nilsen, an Arab cab driver grabbed him, beat him until he was unconscious, and stuffed him into the trunk. When the driver pulled him out of the trunk, he was conscious. Nilsen used a jackhandle to strike the driver, knocking him out. He escaped after locking the victim in the trunk of his cab. His wicked fantasies flourished at the posting thanks to his private room, where he could masturbate in peace. Nilsen made up for his unmet sex desires by viewing himself in the mirror and picturing himself having sexual relations with an unresistant or deceased partner. A freestanding mirror that obscured his head allowed him to split his identity and play out his dreams of being both the dominating and submissive partner. Nilsen stated that his fantasies escalated after his near-death experience during the kidnapping, after seeing several dead bodies in Aden, and after seeing a painting titled The Raft of the Medusa, which was painted in the 19th century. He would eventually fulfill one of his most vivid fantasies, which involved washing a victim's body in a bathtub, in the majority of the murders he would perform. When Nilsen got back from Aden, he was put in charge of feeding 30 men and 2 officers at the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders Seaton Barracks in Plymouth. After a year of service, in 1969 he was moved to Cyprus. The few months he spent there were cut short when he was moved back to West Berlin. There, he'd meet a lady for the first time in a sexual context. Despite subsequently calling the experience overrated and depressing, Nilsen hired a prostitute and boasted about it to his co-workers. After a brief stint cooking for the Queen's Royal Guard, Nilsen was transferred to the Shetland Islands in January 1971. In October of 1972, after 11 years of service, he would complete this mission and then leave the military at the rank of corporal. Nilsen stayed with his family from October to December of 1972 as he deliberated over his professional future. His mother often expressed her desire to see Nilsen settle down with a wife and raise a family over her hope that he would pursue another job. Nilsen's final break with his family came after he and his brother and sister-in-law went to a documentary on gay men with another couple. While Nilsen advocated LGBT rights, the audience laughed at the topic. The 2 brothers got into an argument, and Olav Jr. told their mom that Nilsen was gay. Nilsen stopped communicating with his brother and only occasionally wrote to his other relatives. Nilsen joined the Metropolitan Police Force in December to get away from his family and start a new life in London. April 1973. After completing his training, Nilsen was sent to the Willesden Green office. However, his time as a cop wouldn't endure forever. After a broken relationship in December 1973 prompted Nilsen to fear his employment was negatively impacting his career, he resigned from the force. Nilsen worked as a security guard for a short time before landing a government job in May 1974 at the Jobcenter on Denmark Street. Nilsen was an active member of the labor union and was seen as a modest, devoted worker by his peers. Several of his co-workers suspected him of being an introvert since he constantly offered to work extra shifts. Nilsen was promoted to the position of executive officer with expanded supervisory responsibilities when he was moved to the Kentish town job centre in June 1982. He was doing this work when he was arrested in 1983. David Galachon, who was being threatened by two other guys outside a tavern in November 1975, ran into Nilsen. Nilsen stepped in and invited David back to his apartment in the Cricklewood neighborhood of North London. They hung together for the night, and Nilsen found out that David was gay, jobless, and living in a hostel. They decided to share a larger home the following morning, and Nilsen started looking for a place for them right away. They looked at a ground-floor apartment on Melrose Avenue at 195 and concluded it was right for them after several days of consideration. Nilsen was able to convince the landlord to let them use the backyard exclusively in exchange for a rent reduction. When Nilsen's biological father passed away, he inherited a big sum of money. He utilized a large chunk of that money to purchase a house. In the months that followed, David did much of the actual decorating while Nilsen came to see himself as the primary breadwinner. According to Nilsen, he and David shared sexual attraction but never acted on it. Beginning in 1976, the union showed signs of strain due to the partners' incessant bickering. Nonetheless, according to David's testimony, Nilsen was merely verbally abusive towards him. Nilsen reportedly told David to leave the house after a fight in May 1977, therefore ending their business collaboration. After that, Nilsen dated a few different young men for a short period of time before deciding he was unfit to live with and eventually going solo by late 1978. After spending hours drinking alone in his apartment on December 30, 1978, Nilsen decided he needed to get out of the house at all costs and proceeded to the Cricklewood Arms pub. Stephen Dean Holmes, only 14 at the time, was trying to buy alcohol at the bar when he encountered him. Nilsen allegedly said that he thought Stephen was around 17 years old after inviting him to his residence with the lure of beers and music. He and Stephen drank themselves to sleep at Nilsen's house. Nilsen woke up the next morning ahead of Stephen and found the teenager still sound sleeping in his bed. "I was afraid to wake him in case he left me," Nilsen said later. Later, he decided that Stephen would stay with me over the new year whether he wanted to or not, and gently stroked his sleeping body. Nilsen strangled Stephen with a necktie until he was unconscious, and then he drowned him in a pail of water. Before returning Stephen to his bed, Nilsen took him to the bathroom and gave him a bath. After masturbating over Stephen's body twice, Nilsen waited for the rigors of death to pass before burying him under the floor. After 8 months, on August 11, 1979, Nilsen burned Stephen's body to the ground in the backyard. His remains were never found. Stephen had gone to Willesden to see a pop concert and was finishing up the night at a pub when he was tragically killed. Nilsen kept the details of what happened to Stephen Holmes' life secret from the Holmes family for 20 years after he was arrested. Nilsen met Canadian student Kenneth Ockenden, then 23 years old, in a West End bar on December 3, 1979. After learning that Kenneth was in England to see family, Nilsen casually offered to show him around London, and the latter gladly accepted. They went to Trafalgar Square, Downing Street, and Westminster Abbey after meeting in a tavern. Nilsen enticed Kenneth to return to his apartment by promising more drinks and a meal. On the way to Nilsen's house, they stopped at an off-license and stocked up on whiskey, rum, and beer. Nilsen stated he couldn't remember the exact time he strangled Kenneth, but he did it while wearing wired headphones. The wire was still wrapped around Kenneth's neck when he was dragged across the floor, but he remembered pouring himself a glass of rum and listening to music with the headphones he had used to kill Kenneth. Nilsen bought a Polaroid camera the next day and used it to take pictures of Kenneth's naked body in various provocative positions. Nilsen also recalled embracing Kenneth's body for several hours while watching TV with him laid down on the bed in a spread position above him. Nilsen sealed Kenneth's body in plastic bags and hid it away under the floorboards once he was finished. Nilsen removed Kenneth's body from beneath the floorboards and placed him in an armchair around 4 times over the course of the next 2 weeks, sitting by the body while he watched television and drank. When Nilsen found mold, he was pushed back under the floor. Martin Duffy, then 16, hitchhiked from Birkenhead, Merseyside, to London without telling his parents on May 13, 1980, after being questioned by British Transport Police for not paying his railway fare. Martin had been sleeping rough near Euston Station for 4 days before Nilsen, returning from a union conference in Southport, happened upon him by chance. Nilsen recalled that Martin had accepted the offer of a supper and a place to sleep gladly because he was tired and hungry. Nilsen sat on Martin's chest for leverage as he tightened the ligature around Martin's neck after he had gone to sleep in Nilsen's bed. He kept going until Martin passed out, then dragged him into the kitchen and threw him in the sink full of water. After the murder, he washed the victim's body and put him on a kitchen chair before returning him to his bed. Before and after Martin masturbated on his stomach, Nilsen lavished him with kisses, compliments, and caresses. Nilsen hid Martin's body away for 2 days before he noticed Martin's body was swelling and he went straight under the floorboards. Martin's father kept a picture of his son on his nightstand for years as he searched for him. Later, in a documentary, his sister and brother remarked, "Something like this can tear families apart, but this brought us together. Martin was part of our family, he was loved, and we miss him." William Sutherland, then 26 years old, moved his family from Muir House, Edinburgh, to London in August 1980 so that he could find better employment opportunities. He disappeared just days after his arrival. William and Nilsen first met in a bar close to Piccadilly Circus. Nilsen stated he did not remember the specifics of the murder, other than that he strangled William while standing or kneeling in front of him. "It was the next morning," he said, "when there was another dead body." William's family strongly refuted Nilsen's allegations that he worked as a male prostitute. The circumstances behind William's death remain murky. Another unnamed victim fell victim to Nilsen in September of 1980. Nilsen stated that all he could recall about the man was that he was an Irish laborer, somewhere between 27 and 30 years old, and between 5 feet 9 inches and 5 feet 10 inches in height. His hands were rough, and he was dressed in a worn suit and shoes. At Cricklewood Arms, the two connected. Nilsen later said he made up the whole thing about the man. Nilsen would kill another guy who has never been found the following month. Nilsen just remembered that he was a thin man, maybe 5 feet 10 inches tall, and that he was either Filipino or Mexican. He was in his 20s or 30s, according to Nilsen, and he had gypsy features. They had a date at Salisbury Arms. Nilsen wasn't at work from the 11th to the 18th of the following month, so it's unclear exactly when another person was killed in November 1980, but he was likely an English vagabond in his 20s based on Nilsen's description of him being thin, pallid, and missing many teeth. Nilsen found him sleeping in a doorway near the top of Charing Cross Road. The two rode a cab back to Nilsen's house, where Nilsen presumably offered the man a place to sleep and a hot dinner. That night, Nilsen strangled the man while he slept. Nilsen later explained that he had brutally murdered the man because he considered his life to have been one of long suffering and because he had no remorse for doing so because it was as easy as taking candy from a baby. Nilsen tried to combat the bugs and odors by placing deodorants under the floorboards and by spraying insecticide around his flat twick. However, the remains of the 4 people buried beneath the floorboards began to smell, attracting insects, especially during the summer. Nilsen exhumed the bodies from his apartment in late 1980, dissected them, and burned the remains in a communal bonfire he built, atop which he placed an old car tire, as he had done previously. He later recalled that 3 local children had stood and watched the fire until it was almost out, at which point they left. Nilsen then sifted through the ashes with a rake, looking for recognizable bones, but he found only Nilsen killed again not long after the bonfire, in either November or December of 1980. He claimed that he and the unnamed victim, an English long-haired hippie aged between 25 and 30, had met in the West End after the bars had closed. The body was initially hidden beneath the floorboards of the flat, but Nilsen later removed it, cut it into 3 pieces, and reburied it. Nilsen said he made up this whole story about the victim. They met in the Golden Lion pub in Soho on January 4, 1981, and Nilsen lured him back to his apartment under the guise of a drinking game or contest, where they played their game before Nilsen murdered him. Nilsen described the victim as an 18-year-old, blue-eyed Scot with blonde hair and wearing green tracksuit top and trainers. Nilsen called in sick to work on the 12th and presumably dissected both victims while he was away. Nilsen allegedly committed another crime in February 1981, but he had trouble describing his victim beyond the fact that he was from Belfast, was around 5 feet 9 inches tall, was in his early 20s, and had black hair. After the bars in the West End had closed, the 2 people met. After Nilsen strangled him with a necktie, he joined the bodies of the other 2 guys that had been buried under the floor. Another unidentified victim was reported by Nilsen in April of 1981. He was a powerful 20-year-old English skinhead. He was decked out in a black leather jacket and had a simple cut-here tattoo on the back of his neck. Nilsen enticed the victim back to his apartment by promising him a free lunch and alcohol after he boasted about how tough he was and how much he enjoyed fighting. Nilsen hung the victim's bare torso in his bedroom for a full day before burying him under the floor. Nilsen later said he made up the whole victim thing. Nilsen gutted many of these unnamed victims the next month and dumped the organs in the garbage and on the waste grounds behind his house. On September 18, 1981, the last person was killed at the Melrose Avenue apartment. Nilsen found Malcolm Barlow, age 23, slumped against the wall outside the house. The day before, Malcolm had barely managed to tell Nilsen that the epileptic medicine he used made his legs weak. While Nilsen called for an ambulance, he urged that Malcolm go to the hospital, so he offered to walk Malcolm inside the apartment. After being released from the hospital the next day, Malcolm reportedly went back to the house to personally thank Nilsen for his assistance. Nilsen asked him in for dinner and drinks to have a discussion. After a while, Malcolm slept off on the couch. The next morning, Nilsen hid Malcolm's body under the kitchen sink after strangling him while he slept. In the middle of 1981, Nilsen's owner announced renovation plans and asked all tenants to quit the premises. Nilsen was hesitant at first, but after being paid £1,000 to leave, he quickly cleaned up the apartment and moved out. The day before he departed, Nilsen gathered the bodies of the 5 men who had been living in the apartment, dissected the ones he hadn't previously, and burned them atop a pyre made of old tires. On October 5, 1981, Nilsen settled into his new home at 23D, Cranley Gardens, a Muswell Hill address. Nilsen couldn't fix the floor in his new apartment because it was on the 3rd floor. For over 2 months, Nilsen's visitors that he lured back to his new home left without incident the next morning. On November 23, 1981, Nilsen tried to strangle Paul Nobbs, then 19 years old, but stopped himself before he could complete the act. Nilsen stopped, for reasons that aren't entirely apparent, but he later claimed he was exercising self-control. Nilsen met John Howlett, then 23 years old, in a pub near Leicester Square in March 1982 and enticed him to his apartment by promising to continue drinking and watching a movie. John left Nilsen's room and went to sleep in a separate bed. When Nilsen returned to his bedroom an hour later and saw John still asleep, he made the decision to kill him. Nilsen grabbed an upholstery strap and began strangling John. John woke up and tried to fight back, but the lack of oxygen caused him to pass out. After what Nilsen called the stress of the struggle, in which he was sure he would ultimately be defeated, Nilsen said he returned to the living. Nilsen made 3 attempts to kill John over the course of 10 minutes, each time realizing that John was still alive thereafter. Nilsen finally succeeded in his 3rd attempt to kill John by drowning him in the bathtub. Nilsen's neck bore the bruise of John's fingerprint for over a week after the murder. Nilsen tried to hide John's body under the floorboards, but ultimately had to resort to dismembering and discarding various body parts, including flushing down the toilet some of John's flesh and internal organs and throwing out some large bones with the trash. Nilsen met Carl Stoddard, then 21 years old, in Camden, England's Black Cat Bar in May of 1982. Through their conversation, Nilsen learned that Carl's depression stemmed from a broken romantic relationship. Nilsen enticed Carl to come to his apartment by promising him they wouldn't have any sexual relations. They continued drinking back at the apartment, with Carl eventually passing out in an unzipped sleeping bag. When he opened his eyes, Nilsen was choking him while telling him to stay still in a whisper. Carl testified that before he passed out, he thought Nilsen was trying to unzip his sleeping bag so he could get out of it. Carl awoke once more to the sound of rushing water, but this time he knew he was underwater and that Nilsen was attempting to drown him. Carl's head broke the surface of the water for an instant, and he cried out for help before being buried again and passing out. Assuming Carl was dead, Nilsen sat him down in his favorite chair. Bleep, Nilsen's dog, noticed Carl was still clinging to life by licking his face, and Nilsen realized Carl was in a critical condition. To improve Carl's blood flow, Nilsen started stroking his arms, legs, and chest. He hastily transferred Carl to the bed, where he was swaddled in blankets while he continued his attempts to revive him. Over the course of the next 2 days, Carl would drift in and out of consciousness until he finally mustered the will to confront Nilsen about his memories of being strangled and dumped in frigid water. During a nightmare, Nilsen had him put in cold water because you were in shock when he got stuck in the zip of his sleeping bag. Nilsen walked Carl to the nearest train station once he had recovered nearly completely, saying his goodbyes and expressing his hope that they would see one other again. Nilsen met Graham Allen, then 27 years old, while both were waiting for a cab on Shaftesbury Avenue in September 1982. According to Graham, Nilsen invited him to his house in Cranley Gardens for dinner. Nilsen repeated his previous assertion that he could not remember the exact time he strangled Graham, but he did remember walking up to him as he ate an egg. Nilsen kept Graham's body in the tub for 3 days before he started dissecting him on the kitchen floor. On October 9, 1982, Nilsen took the day off work, saying he was sick. This is quite likely the day he committed this act. Nilsen did it again, clogging the pipes in the house with discarded pieces of meat and tiny bones. Stephen Sinclair, Nilsen's 20th and final victim, was last seen by friends and acquaintances on January 26, 1983, while the two were strolling toward a subway station. Stephen was a heroin addict with a history of self-injury and suicidal ideation when he met Nilsen. After injecting a shot of heroin and drinking alcohol with Nilsen, Stephen reportedly passed out in Nilsen's apartment. Nilsen crouched in front of Stephen as he slept and strangled him with a ligature made of a rope and a necktie. Nilsen found crepe bandages around Stephen's wrists after he had passed out. Upon removing them, he found the wounds from his most recent suicide attempt. After washing Stephen and laying him on the bed in his bedroom, Nilsen followed the same technique he had used on all of his prior victims. He sprinkled talcum powder over his body. Nilsen placed 3 mirrors around the bed and then lay down next to the deceased man, revealing himself some hours later. He gave him a forehead kiss, said goodbye, and then went to sleep next to his body. Nilsen dissected Stephen's body in the same way he did his first 2 victims, placing various portions of the body in plastic bags around his flat and covering them with bandages from Stephen's wrists. He flushed smaller bones and bits of flesh and internal organs down the toilet, further clogging the system. Nilsen sent a complaint letter to the property managers on February 4, 1983, citing the inconvenient status of the blocked drains for the building's multiple occupants. Nilsen denied entry to a friend the following day, most likely because he had started dismembering Stephen's body on the kitchen floor. Dynarod worker Michael Catran replied to Nilsen's written complaint on the 8th of February. When Michael removed the drain cover from the houses outside, he found a fleshy material and countless little bones inside. He notified his boss, Gary Wheeler, of the odd materials, but they decided to wait until the morning to look into the obstruction. Before Nilsen and his roommate moved out, they got together to debate where the meat came from. After seeing Michael claim it looked like human flesh, Nilsen tried to cover up his dump by saying, "It looks to me like someone has been flushing down their Kentucky Fried Chicken." When the Dino Rod crew arrived the following morning at 7:30 a.m., they discovered that the drain had been emptied, fueling the men's suspicions. Michael found a few pieces of flesh and 4 bones in the drain pipe that led to Nilsen's apartment on the 2nd floor. After calling the police, the workmen found more little bones and mushy bits inside the same pipe. Pathologist David Bowen informed investigators that the bones were human, and that one of the pieces shown was from a human neck with a ligature mark. Police learned from tenants that Nilsen lived in the top flat, so Detective Chief Inspector Peter J. and 2 other officers waited outside for him to come from work. Upon his return, they informed him that they had come to investigate a clog in the pipes leading from his apartment. Nilsen questioned the police officers, asking if the other 2 were health inspectors and why they were so interested in his drains. Jay revealed to Nilsen that they were all law enforcement officers and insisted that they finish their conversation there. When the police entered, they smelled what appeared to be rotting flesh. Nilsen wondered why the police were concerned about the clogged drains since he was already used to the odor. Nilsen finds out at this point that the police already know the flesh is human and not animal. After feigning shock, Nilsen quietly led the police to the neighboring wardrobe where they found the rest of the body after being pressured by Detective Chief Inspector J. Officers could smell whatever was inside the closet, so they didn't bother opening it. Nilsen said, "It's a long story, it goes back a long time," when they tried to probe deeper. "I'm going to spill the beans. Just need to get this out of my system. The police station, not here." Before being escorted to the Hornsey police station, he was arrested on suspicion of murder and cautioned. Nilsen was asked in Way if there were 1 or 2 sets of remains. 15 or 16, Nilsen said. Since 1978. Detective Superintendent Chambers returned to the flat with DCIJ and Bowen the night of Nilsen's arrest. The plastic bags were removed from the closet and delivered to the Hornsey crematorium. A shopping bag held numerous internal organs, and another bag contained 2 dismembered torsos, one of which had been chopped vertically. An empty human skull, a severed head, and a torso with the limbs and hands still attached but gone were found in a second bag. Both heads had been treated to wet heat. Nilsen admitted on February 10 that he had more remains in an upturned drawer in the bathroom and a tea box in the living room. He said he tried to kill about 7 others, but they all got away or were revived and released. On the same day, a search uncovered a skull, a torso section, and other bones in the tea chest, as well as the lower half of a torso and 2 legs stored in a bag in the bathroom. On the same day, Nilsen took the police to his former Melrose Avenue residence to show them the 3 pyres where he had burned the bones. Nilsen was arrested and charged with murdering Stephen Sinclair at 5:40 p.m. on the 11th. He was formally questioned that evening after agreeing to be represented by a lawyer, an option he had first denied. Over the course of the next few days, authorities interviewed Nilsen 16 times for a total of 30 hours. When asked for a motivation, Nilsen was adamant that the choice to kill had not been formed until the very time of the deed, and he responded, "I'm hoping you will tell me that." Nilsen usually gave his victims a bath after he killed them, shaved their chest hair to make them seem more like him, and covered up any flaws on their skin with cosmetics. Nilsen would typically wrap the victim's clothes over his body, which were only wearing socks and underwear. Nilsen usually masturbated next to or over the body of his victim. Nilsen admitted to having intercrural intercourse with the victims on occasion, but he insisted he had never penetrated their bodies because they were too perfect and beautiful for the pathetic ritual of commonplace sex. They were just prop in Nilsen's dreams, he said. After the ritualistic washing, Nilsen either destroyed or appropriated all of the victims' personal belongings. When asked about the wet heat treatment of the heads recovered in Cranley Gardens, Nilsen explained that he routinely cooked the heads of his victims in a big boiling pot so that the inside fluids drained, eliminating the need to dispose of the brain and flesh. Nilsen, when incarcerated at HMP Brixton on August 1, 1983, hurled his soiled toilet paper out of his cell, striking multiple guards. On August 9, a judge convicted him guilty of assaulting prison staff, resulting in 56 days of solitary imprisonment. On October 24, 1983, Nilsen went to trial for 6 counts of murder and 2 counts of attempted murder. On November 3, he was convicted guilty of all counts of murder and attempted murder against him, including those involving Paul Nobbs. Nilsen received a life sentence in prison with a minimum recommended term of 25 years. Nilsen was sent from HMP Full Sutton to York Hospital on May 10 after he reported significant abdominal pain. A blood clot developed as a consequence of the operation used to repair his ruptured abdominal aortic aneurysm. Nilsen passed away on May 12.